I'd like to start this presentation by talking about some of the super megaliths out there, like Baalbek in Lebanon, 1870 photo. These are the largest megaliths that we know of right now. They're the only ones, they're the largest we know of. There could be other megaliths that are underwater and stuff like that that we don't know about. Baalbek is in Lebanon, right on the Syrian border, and it's actually quite a dangerous place in a way. What happened here? Here we go. The largest stone at Baalbek is still in the quarry. It weighs 1,650 tons. That is gigantically huge. Even a stone that weighs only 5 tons or 10 tons is giant. That's twice as a big Ford pickup truck weighs around 5 tons or so. So when you start talking like 20 tons or 50 tons or 100 tons, you're already talking about some huge, very heavy megalith to move. This is 1,650 tons. It would take, we almost have no way of moving this ourselves. You would need like a stationary crane, that's in a port or something. So I was talking about here the giant megalithic stones and stuff like that. This one is in Jerusalem. So there's also one of these huge stones in Jerusalem that's in a tunnel. They couldn't even see it until recently. We don't even know how big or how much this weighs, but it's similar in a way to the things at Baalbek. And it's also got perfectly fitted smaller blocks here, the big blocks up here. So this is really something. The Mediterranean itself, too. The Mediterranean was flooded in ancient times. And it used to be the Mediterranean was just some small lakes, and then it became flooded. There's over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean, over 200. This is one off Sicily, and it was a monolith that's underwater. Here's some photos of it. It has a hole at one end. It's also like a giant obelisk or standing stone. And, right now it's in probably 50 feet of water or something like that off Sicily. So this is part of, this ancient civilization that was flooded probably, and that's what happened was the Pillars of Hercules sort of opened a big earthquake, and then the Atlantic poured into the Mediterranean. I've always been fascinated by obelisks. One of my books out there is about obelisks. This is an aerial photo of the unfinished obelisk at Aswan. This obelisk, if it had been removed from the quarry, would have weighed about 1,000 tons. Your average obelisk, which is a monolith of granite, and granite is infused with quartz crystals, weighs about 500 tons. This one weighs 1,000 tons. So any obelisk is just an anomaly. I mean, they're huge. And how they would quarry and lift an obelisk out of the quarry. What happened to the unfinished obelisk was that as they were cutting and quarrying the obelisk, and they had quarried on all the sides, and they started to cut underneath the obelisk to free it from the bedrock rock in Aswan. But then they noticed, as they started to get under the obelisk, that it had a natural crack, that they couldn't see it, until they went under the obelisk. As soon as they saw that crack, they stopped work on the obelisk because they couldn't use it anymore. An obelisk had to be perfect. It can't have any cracks and stuff in it because they're like giant acupuncture needles or something like that in the earth. So I've always been interested in Atlantis and Lemuria, lost lands, sunken lands, and stuff like that. Some of the things tomorrow we'll be talking about Atlantis. So Atlantis were these concentric circles and canals and stuff like that, and you went into a central city in the middle of Atlantis, and there was like a big pyramid and stuff. There was also supposedly a big mountain to the north of Atlantis. We can talk about that more tomorrow. Out in the Pacific, too, this Kumari Kandam. This is this land that Tamils say was south of India and even connected to Australia, kind of like a Lemuria or something like that. James Churchward, who wrote the famous book, Lost Continent of Mu. He was a British colonel, and in the late 1800s, he began traveling around the Pacific. He was told by his teacher in India to go out and look for proof of this lost continent of Mu. So this is one of his maps in color, and it's interesting here because, he talks about lost continent of Mu and stuff, and then Atlantis, and then South America is this Amazonian Sea, which is pretty interesting too. So, it's speculative. He also talked about pole shifts, how these cataclysmic pole shifts in the past would create these, cataclysms and sinkhole continents and stuff like that. So, here, we're going to talk about really Pacific and exploration of the Pacific and who the Polynesians and stuff were. Because ultimately they are the CAM. So you have the Polynesian Triangle there in the middle. Hawaii's at the north, New Zealand's down at the south. Easter Island is way to the east at one corner of that. Then you have Micronesia. Melanesia, they're all blacks in that area. Although how they got there, we don't know. Blacks are supposedly from Africa, but this whole area is blacks. And they, you have to wonder how they got there. They came on boats and stuff. This is the Kaimanawa Wall in New Zealand. And back in around 1998, I went to New Zealand. I was on the BBC and stuff like that because of this. And this is these giant blocks in the north, kind of middle of the North Island of New Zealand. They called it the Kaimanawa Wall. And it looks like they're quarried huge blocks there. The New Zealand government actually sent, a geologist there because they needed to prove that it was just natural. And so they kept saying like, oh, well, it just kind of blocks fell and stuff. So what they were trying to do then was dig right here, right in front of where I'm standing, and they kept thinking, oh, we'll find all this rubble from this collapsed wall, and they couldn't find it. So all that's there are these cut blocks and stuff. This became very controversial in New Zealand and still is today. So here's what's interesting too. We were talking about Egypt as Kemet and all that. These are from the Cairo Museum, and these are statues of Bes. Bes is the god of good luck in Egypt. But the one there on the left looks like a tiki. I mean, it looks very, very Polynesian, very Hawaiian kind of thing. But this is from the Cairo Museum. When they got to islands like the Marquesas Islands and stuff like that, people were heavily tattooed, and they would have what looked like star charts and chessboards and stuff on them. So, it's pretty interesting who these guys are. Here's more of them on, this is also Marquesas Islands. So these guys would have all these tattoos, and even today in Samoa and New Zealand, people are heavily tattooed with even facial tattoos and stuff like that. Tonga was the one Polynesian area that was still traveling in huge ships throughout the Pacific. And this is a Tongaraki canoe here. They were huge. They would hold about 300 people or so. And Tonga was the only Pacific island group that was not really colonized. They still had a king and stuff, although it did become a protectorate of Britain. This guy here, Chris Young, the Tui Manua of Samoa. This is American Samoa, 1910. This guy supposedly was the ruler of the entire Pacific from this little island in American Samoa called Manua. And that's an obsidian island, so there's obsidian sources there. But this guy supposedly could fly, okay? And his family, the Young family, I understand, moved to Utah and became Mormons, and so some of them live in Salt Lake City or something like that. But so he was a curious guy, and this is an unusual photo.